very early morning in India. Thank you. Thank you all for joining on Zoom or being here on such a beautiful day. Yesterday was 132nd and birthday of Dr. Ambedkar. So happy Ambedkar Jayanti and Jai Bhim, everyone. I'm Raju Rajagopal, co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights. And this is the fourth in a series of conversations we are having titled Desh-Videsh Conversations, Speaking Across the Divide, and an acknowledgement, an implicit acknowledgement that there are many areas that divide our community, and we need to start talking more honestly about these issues. And the first one was in November, and this was in the context of the Citizenship Amendment Act. The second Desh-Videsh was in January on UAPA. And third one on March 18th on Untold Stories of Kashmir. Is that reverberating or is it? Okay. The March 18th Kashmir webinar was designed to hear both the voices of Kashmiri Pandits who still remain in the valley, as well as hear the ground situation for the majority community of Muslims in Kashmir. Unfortunately, the panelist, Professor Athar Zia from University of Northern Colorado, couldn't join us to give us a ground situation report. So we are bringing her back on to complete the process on May 6th, around this time, but it'll be entirely virtual. So those of you who want to join and hear stories about what is really happening on the ground in Kashmir, which many of those are in fact untold stories even today. I was talking to somebody in Srinagar just yesterday, and the situation he describes for his family and everybody is so horrific that we wouldn't even dream of that kind of a situation. So we do need to hear that side of the story as well. So that's on May 6th, part 2 of Untold Stories from Kashmir. So today we are talking about a topic that has taken on an increased level of attention in the United States following several resolutions by legislatures on caste discrimination or banning caste discrimination, Seattle being the first city. And of course, the subtext of caste discrimination here is very much, in many ways, goes back to the reservation policies in India, as more and more marginalized people from marginalized communities are joining us here in the Indian American community. Some of the caste biases certainly are showing up. And so we thought it's a good time to bring on panelists who are very familiar with what's happening today and the history of caste reservations in India. And we have with us an eminent panel, but I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Professor of Anthropology from William Patterson University in New Jersey. He was also on the advisory board of Hindus for Human Rights, and he is a friend as well, and he specializes on caste issues. So we are very, very happy that he's here to join us to talk to our panelists, and I'll let him introduce our panelists. So Bal Murli, it's yours, all yours.
Thank you, Raju, and warm welcome to everybody, India, East, West Coast, wherever you are. Jai Bhim, and I am very happy to be part of this attempt to actually start public conversations in certain sections of the population that are willing to participate in it. I'll keep my remarks very brief because we have a very good set of panelists, and I hope they're all present. I'm not able to see some of them, Raju, but I'll just keep my things very brief. Reservations, of course, is the lightning rod for any discussion on caste. And one reason for this is that it is the debates around that tends to be dominated not by those who have simply reservations about reservations, which is the title of today's talk. That is, they're not just saying that they're not sure that it is good or bad. The ones who dominate this conversation are those who are outright against reservations. They are clear that reservations have to go. And thus, I would say, just to frame the whole thing, there are two kinds of arguments that I can broadly think about. One is that reservations don't work argument, which is actually put forward by those who we could say have reservations about reservations. But the other kind of argument is the reservation is wrong argument, which is put forward by those who want reservations to be annihilated. Not caste annihilation, but annihilation of reservations. And so in the reservations are wrong argument, one can probably easily identify some big ones. For example, the one which is typically brought out is that reservations is against merit, and hence it is unjust. Or the other one is that reservation is against privileged caste and therefore again unjust. And such arguments therefore make reservations itself appear to be casteist rather than admit that it may be an attempt to definitely be anti-casteist. So on the reservations don't work argument, you could see a slew of much more fine-grained attempts at showing maybe reservations about reservations. And some of them would be that reservations should not really be caste-based, but it should be socioeconomic status-based, and hence there's a category problem. Some others could be that the reservations as we see it today is really not benefiting the most vulnerable, those who need to be benefited, and in that sense, it is a flawed system. Some others might actually be in a denial thing, saying that, well, caste used to be the thing, caste is no longer there, so why do we need reservations? And then maybe some might say, well, that reservations actually has some serious consequences. For example, it divides the population, but they don't pay attention to the already long history of divisiveness, exclusiveness, hierarchy, and things like that. And finally, there may be some who might say that reservations ought not to be going on and on and on forever. So we need some serious time limits on that. But notably, I would say that none of these arguments actually question, at least not anymore, that reservations have indeed helped those who have got it. There is enough evidence now, it's by case studies, ethnographic, as well as quantitative studies that show that this is indeed the case, that people who are doing well today in several professions attest to the ways in which they have been aided fundamentally aided by reservations. So today we will start with what are the barriers to a level playing field and what are the costs to society. And then we will reflect on what some current major challenges are and wrap up with a historical reminder of why reservations are needed and for who. So if it's all right, then I will invite Miss Meena Kotwal.
Balburli?
Yes.
Meena and Professor Thorat have not logged on. I'm trying to remind them. So we have Professor Deshpande and Ankur and Riya online.
All right. Well, then let us start with Ankur Paliwal. Welcome, Ankur, and it's a pleasure to see you. I think a number of people would have hopefully read the brilliant piece that you published in the Nature a few months ago. And Ankur, for those of you who don't know, is an independent journalist who writes about science, inequality, and LGBTQIA+ community. Ankur focuses on the stories of underreported people and places, and he's written about neglected crops and diseases. So he has a pretty wide range of things, crops and diseases, on being queer and about indigenous communities, and climate change and conflict from India, Ethiopia, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Germany, and the United States. And of course, he writes about caste and diversity. So all yours, Ankur. Since we don't have some of the other panelists, I will of course be flexible about time, but let's hear you, let's say, for somewhere around 12 to some minutes around there.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm definitely delighted to be here. What I'll do is that I'll share a short presentation just so that my thoughts are in line. Yeah. Are you guys able to see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I have been writing about caste bias in science and generally about caste, especially in scientific institutions that sort of specializes in science and technology. And these includes IITs, IISCs, and a couple of other universities. And because I've been writing about science in general for quite some time, I would often talk to students who are at the undergrad level or masters or PhDs. And because I've been writing about caste, I would often interact with students from underprivileged communities, whether they are Dalits, Adivasis, or Bahujan people. There are few. And every time I would speak to them about their experiences in the educational campuses where they were studying or becoming new lecturers and readers, there was one common theme that started emerging a couple of years ago when I started writing about caste. And it was a version of there is nobody like me around me. And that had consequences, not just in terms of how they would progress in their career, whether they would decide to go to the next stage, but also it had consequences in terms of their own self-worth, how they would feel about themselves, on their whether they feel isolated or included, whether they feel happy or not, were they more anxious. So it had all kinds of implications, just not having people from their own community around them. So to sort of so I thought maybe I should collect data to really understand how bad the situation is. And none of this data, when I started looking at the institutional websites and their annual reports, this data was just not present. I wrote to the institutional directors, but didn't get this data. So then I started filing RTIs, Right to Information Act in India, equivalent of FOIA in the US, Freedom of Information Act. And through that, I started getting data. And I was specifically looking at science and technology institutes and some bigger universities like JNU and BHU in India, Banaras Hindu University and Jawaharlal Nehru University. And after months of data collection, what I found was both surprising and not surprising to me. I kind of just like confirmed what the students were telling me. And so overall, when you look at all the institutions I was sort of considering for my report in Nature, they have less than 1% professors from Dalit and Adivasi community, less than 1%. So when students talk of having no role models, this is what they talk about. There were some institutes, this is 2020 data, so I don't know if the situation has changed much, but my understanding is that it hasn't. There are some institutes like Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, one of the biggest and most prestigious institutions, did not have even a single professor from Dalit and Adivasi community. An equivalent of that in the US would be a totally white institution. So I thought that maybe I should sort of go back and sort of see where is the problem emerging and is it different at different levels of science and tech education in India. So I started with undergrad data. This data I gathered from the numbers that the Government of India, its higher education department collects through its higher education survey. And this data is again from 2020. There is no fresh data after that. So I don't know what's happening there. When we looked at the data, it very clearly showed that students from Dalit and Adivasi communities were more represented in arts courses, like more BAs, than more BScs. So they were less in science courses, but it was sort of different for privileged communities where it was almost equal. And they were overrepresented in a lot of other science streams, which was not the case for Dalit and Adivasi communities. And we know of the reservation policies, the affirmative action policies in India. So 15% are to be admitted, 15% Dalits should be admitted, and 7.5% it's for Adivasis. As you can see that while they are able to cross this reservation line in case of arts and humanities courses, but that's not the case for science and technology courses. So I started interviewing researchers from these communities to understand what's happening and sort of really interview the caste scholars or Dalit scholars who have been studying higher education. And there were a couple of responses I got, and it may not be, there might be several things going on, but there's a few things that I sort of understood. One was that clearly it wasn't the case that they liked arts or humanities courses more. And that's why the representation was more in those courses. It was just that the places they are in or are coming from, they didn't have science teachers or science courses in the colleges or schools close to them. That would mean that the colleges were far away and they would have to take transport, or it's a long day of cycling, or they would have to take a hostel in that area. And that would mean time away from helping parents, say, with agriculture labor or other professions that their parents were engaged in and needed help. So they had to decide whether they can actually spend time away from family or be more useful at the house. And another thing that came out very clearly was the lack of role models within their own families. In their own family and even in the extended network, they didn't have enough people from the science and tech background, because of which they couldn't ask people what it would mean for them if they sort of take science or technology courses. Or the fee of these courses was tended to be higher because they included practical exams and stuff. There were fewer people to guide them. So it's like a complete opposite of privileged communities having enough people in their family and family network whom they could just talk to, write to, that this is what I want. If I want to study chemistry, what should I do? And what are my career prospects? What kind of challenges I would face? So they didn't have access to this kind of network. The situation pretty much stays the same even at the master's level. And the barriers are also the same. One of the barriers at the master's level is that whether or not the students come in through accessing reservation policies or affirmative action, one of the biggest things that they talked about was that when they do come in, they do not get the support they need to understand the subjects that they needed better information about. And just there was a lot of alienation they faced from the educational institutes, their own peers, the behavior of professors. So there were several both spoken and unspoken reminders of caste, which started making them feel alienated. And the coursework also seemed pretty intense to them, because the educational institutes they were coming from, their fundamentals, basic fundamentals of science and tech were not that strong. So they needed more help, and their teachers and professors were not willing to. So they started feeling disoriented. Some of them would continue, and at this place, some of them drop out. And I spoke to some of the people who dropped out because of these reasons, because of the reasons of not having support system around them, whether it was of the peers or of institutional or of their teachers. But the massive decline happens at the PhD level. There was still a good representation at undergrad and master's level, but at the PhD level, it starts to decline massively. In the institutions I was looking at, just 10% representation of Dalits and just 2% representation of Adivasis at the PhD level. So what's happening here? There are a couple of things that came up, and I want to talk about. All of us know PhD is like a nightmarish process for a lot of people, and I think more so for students and researchers from the Dalit, Adivasi, and Bahujan community. One thing that I understood after talking to them, and also I interviewed professors from privileged communities who spoke candidly with me off the record. So I have some understanding of how they were viewing the whole situation. One thing that came up was the recommendation networks, which was that at the PhD season, when the admissions are happening or applications are being invited, a lot of these professors would get calls, emails, messages from their own network saying that my student, my daughter, or somebody I know is applying, look out for that. So there's already some sort of a relationship established about the applicant who is coming from a social capital, something that students or researchers from the underprivileged communities didn't have. And when they would reach the interview stage, a lot of them talked of bias of the interviewing committees. The students told me that they felt incredibly nervous. There were questions that were too hard, and or just the whole atmosphere was pretty intimidating for them. And it didn't seem like to them that some of them even said that in the room, it felt like that they were already against them or didn't want the student to come in. When I spoke to the interviewing committees, they would say that the students are not good enough, they're not able to give answers, and we expect a crisp presentation explaining the research that they want to do in a crisp manner, but all of these things the students are not able to provide. So how do we take them? And when we compare this to students who are coming from better educational backgrounds or better universities, they are able to do all of this. So this understanding of why that is happening, who is able to present better in these interviews, and how much role caste and social capital has to play there was missing in the interviewing committees, even though some of them had representations from marginalized communities. But even after that, if the students do come in to the system at the PhD level, they do get admitted, whether or not through reservation policies. The most common actually barriers that all of them talked about was struggle to find a good mentor. Sometimes mentors would be assigned to them. Sometimes they would ask around who can sort of supervise them. And there was a common sort of discouragement that they would get, a lot of caste reminders they would get. Teachers would tell them that, oh, you are a quota person, you can just go anywhere, anybody would take you, but they wouldn't take the person. And even if the teachers would take them because of institutional pressures or some other pressure, students said that they would feel a lot of discouragement from their own professors. They would not give enough time or resources which the student needed. And when I interviewed the privileged community professors, they told me off the record that, look, Ankur, they do need more support than the students who generally speaking, than the students who come from privileged communities. And I don't have that kind of time or resources to provide them. I am slave of a system which is all about publish and perish. And to be able to progress in my own careers and publish high quality scientific papers in journals like Nature, Science, Cell, I need a student who can help me and help me do it fast. So there is really no institutional or general ecosystem incentive for me to to really give the or devote the time or resources that the students need. So there is a lot to be talked about and understood there. And when I interviewed Dalit and Adivasi professors, wherever I could find them in these institutions, they said that they have heard similar things. And there's actually institutional pressure on them to take students from their own community. So the institutional head would tell them that, look, it's a student from your community, why don't you support them? But they want to, but they didn't like this pressure from the institutions to just take students from your own community. They wanted to progress too, and they needed to give more time to the students. So this kind of disparity and bias also exists in the institutions. And because the representation is that 98% or sometimes 99% professors are from privileged communities, there again the lack of role models, people they could go to with their questions or the challenges they were facing, somebody who can understand their stories, they could relate to. That kind of exchange was not happening, and that starts becoming demotivating for a lot of students. About affirmative action, one thing that came up clearly by after interviewing a lot of professors and teachers broadly from underprivileged communities was that although affirmative action policies are extremely helpful in getting the student in to the system, but if there is this widespread discrimination, which is both visible and invisible, because of which the students are not progressing or are dropping out or are feeling disoriented, then is it really happening? Is it really helping? Sorry. Because if they're not progressing or are dropping out, then the representation or that 1% representation doesn't really change. And so this is the same data that I talked about earlier, where just 1% professors are from Dalit and Adivasi communities. At the faculty level, I'll just quickly talk about, I mean, the emotion here is the same, and which is of alienation, which is of bias. Because of that, even the posts like associate professor and assistant professors, which is like sort of more junior than the professor level, even at that level, 90% of the representation is by privileged community. One Dalit assistant professor told me that institutions should admit candidates from marginalized communities if they reach the interview stage. just because just on the basis that they reached there, which took a lot from them. When this professor would sit in selection committees, he would see that they would start comparing the student who is, or sorry, the candidate who is coming from underprivileged communities with somebody, say, who is coming from a degree at Columbia, or a higher degree in TIFR, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. They would, some of them would have differences in how they were presenting, how articulate they were, how what kind of presentation they are able to give, whether that's crisp or not. And so just this comparison of between the privileged and underprivileged communities, how they are able to perform at the interview stage, what seemed unfair to the Dalit professor. So there's a lot to be talked about, the selection committee bias, and the assistant and associate professors who are sort of just beginning their careers in these institutions. They talked about having little to no support systems for them to progress in their careers, whether it was things like how do you write a grant application? How do you use those keywords in the grant applications that would give them a funding? How you can make these grant applications more successful. And so then because this grant writing thing kept coming up, for which they needed a lot of help, because they would apply to Department of Science and Technology at the Government of India, or Department of Biotechnology, and many such departments which provide a lot of funding to researchers. But they were not getting successful, even the big ones. And so this is just my last slide. So I started looking at what's happening at the funding stage. And this funding is really critical for researchers to progress in their career or set up labs that they want to. And very clearly, it came through that about 80% of the funding was going to the privileged communities. And I asked the government, why is that happening? And I got a very one-line response saying that all this is based strictly on merit. So whoever is more meritorious is getting the funding. And that's a lot for us to unpack there. So I'll just stop here, and I'm very glad that I was able to present my findings here. And I'm happy to see Professor Desh-Pandey here, whose writings I've read, and they've really informed me. So I'm looking forward to hearing from him too. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ankur. Do we have Meena here yet, Raju?
No, we are trying to get her.
Okay, all right. So
currently she has a sick child, and she's trying to get on, and we will see. So you can go ahead and introduce Professor.
Well, then let me invite Satish Deshpande, who is one of India's leading sociologists and a professor of sociology at Delhi University. I'm not going to go into his very long CV, but he's definitely been one of those engaged sociologists whose scholarly works have been complemented suitably by a series of public engagements and clarifying many of the complicated debates, not only around fundamental approaches in sociology, but also on definitely the issue of caste. One of the most interesting pieces that he is probably known for is for theorizing about the sense of castelessness, or the misconceived sense of castelessness that a lot of privileged caste folks end up buying into, and demolishing some of the myths around that. He has written several books and scholarly papers, and we look forward to his interventions today. Welcome, Satish.
Thank you. Thank you, Murli. Let me begin by saying that we are in a sort of climate in India today where, these kinds of routine introductions of the sort that Murli just gave begin to sound like charge sheets, that things that you are sort of accused of rather than, being praised for, as I'm sure Murli intended. So I just wanted to start on that note. So 10 to 12 minutes I've been told. It's 7:10 now, so I shall speak until 7:21 or 22. Let me, you must forgive me because I've been speaking on reservation for 30 years and more now. So I will speed through things to get as much of the complicated story in as possible. And you can always ask me questions in the question and answer session. So the Constitution of India, which is also associated with Baba Saheb Ambedkar's name, whose birthday we have been celebrating, introduced into India a contradictory inheritance. On the one hand, it created for the first time in our history, and this has to be said again and again, for the very first time in our history, it created the idea of equal citizenship. That is to say, citizenship unrestricted by any other attribute, such as caste, religion, gender, etc., etc. And at the same time, the same document also instituted what we call today reservation as part of the Constitution. So we have this contradictory inheritance of, on the one hand, the Constitution seeming to more or less abolish caste or refuse to recognize caste distinctions. And on the other hand, the same Constitution instituting caste-based reservations and therefore explicitly recognizing caste. Now, because of this contradictory inheritance, we have this contradictory inheritance made it possible for differently placed Indians to answer the critical question, which, in a sense, determines almost everything about this policy called reservation. And that critical question is there caste discrimination in India today? Forget about the past, and let's vaguely assume that we also are agreed on the future, that we want a future without caste. But the crucial question is there caste discrimination in India today? Because of the Constitution and its apparent abolishing of caste distinctions, many were able to say no. From today, that is to say from 26 January 1950, caste discrimination is a thing of the past. Whereas the policy of reservation was, in a sense, a tacit acknowledgement that caste discrimination at any rate had existed in the past and perhaps needed to be redressed in the present as well. So we are coming from this kind of a background where the central issue is, do you recognize the existence of caste discrimination as such? Let me now step back from this to the somewhat complicated history of practical models of reservation as a policy. Just remember this, where we have left the story so far, that different answers become possible with the new Constitution to the question, is there caste discrimination in India today? So looking at the models of caste, reservation that have been in operation in India, you can recognize 4 or 5 different models. So historically, the first to get started, not necessarily conceptually or ideologically, but definitely the first to get started as a policy is what was instituted in what was then the Madras Presidency, almost exactly a century ago, a little more than a century ago, 1921-22, which was known as the communal GO, the communal government order. And here the word communal doesn't mean what it means today in India. It was more in the sense of communitarian. So this model essentially said that seats in educational institutions and government jobs would be proportionately shared out amongst all the major caste groupings or communities that were there, caste and religious groupings that were there. So this was a system of proportional sharing. Now, what exactly the proportions were and so on, those are all questions. But broadly speaking, a system of proportional sharing. Then we had the model that our constitution brought about, which was a model which said that a portion of the government seats or seats in the legislature, in higher education and in government jobs and so on, a portion of these will be set aside for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, an officially created category that listed a number of tribes and castes who had been at the bottom of the Indian social system or excluded from the Indian social system. And the remaining positions will be unreserved and open for competition, amongst, presumably amongst equals. What had happened between the early rise of demands for reservation and so on to its implementation via the constitution, a very significant shift had occurred that made possible yet another model of reservation, which shared something with the constitutional model. And this was a model based on some form of disadvantage, or the more common term, backwardness. So particularly socially and educationally backward communities were thought to be deserving of some form of redressal. And what is known as the Mandal reservation, or the reservation for OBCs, was primarily of this kind, which was instituted in 1991. After the 1990s, there have been other models of reservation where neither the constitutional provisions for communities tacitly recognized as suffering from exclusion, nor the language of backwardness or disadvantage were really sort of thought to be true, although the disadvantage, language of disadvantage was invoked ideologically and politically. Nevertheless, this was more an expression of the electoral clout of these communities. So demands for reservation by Patidars, Jats, Marathas, Kapus, and so on also began to be expressed, and to varying degrees, there were attempts to introduce these, and the courts took different views and so on. There's this whole sort of story about that, which is largely a regional story. And then finally, most recently, we have had what is known as the EWS reservation, or the reservation for the economically weaker sections, which is a unique form and introduces a completely new form of reservation, which is very unlike everything else that has been there so far. So we have these 5 models, and now we need to go back to the question that I started with, the question to which Indians give a split answer: is there caste discrimination in India today? So those who answer no, for them, the only possible justification for reservation could be some form of backwardness or disadvantage. And this model, this just broad justification for reservation, is in the sense, literally in the sense of a lack that needs to be filled. There is a vessel that is not as full as it should be. It's a little bit empty. And so we need to fill that vessel until it reaches the average level or whatever is there. So a redressal of a deficit, a fulfilling or compensating for a deficit, that kind of model. Whereas the discrimination-based model, those who say, yes, there is discrimination, leave open the door, or can also advocate for a form of reservation, which is essentially a form of forced inclusion to counter forced exclusion. If caste discrimination is forced exclusion from realms of privilege of various kinds, then there must be forced inclusion as a answer for that. What is the purpose of this forced inclusion, and what for both these justifications, backwardness as well as discrimination? We also need to ask what image of the future, or what is the path to how do they want to deal with this problem in the future? With backwardness, we've seen that it is fulfilling a deficit. As soon as that deficit is fulfilled, then we have reached a future of equality. For the discrimination argument, things are less clear. And the interesting thing about the 1950 constitutional model, which included an unreserved category contrasted with a reserved portion, we could think of the unreserved category as the path to a future, where we could think of reservation as its function being to, over generations, change the social composition of the unreserved category. And the moment when the unreserved category the social composition begins to resemble that of society as a whole, we know that we have been able to achieve the inclusion of those who were excluded, and we can dismantle reservation. So the EWS reservation, the most recent model of reservation, in a sense stands this whole logic on its head. Why does it do so? It does so because it implicitly argues that even communities, in terms of the discrimination model, even communities that are the discriminators, so to speak, by definition, in a systemic sense, not in a sense of personal or individual accusation, but in a systemic sense, who are the discriminators, can be allowed to share in the same system that is being used to redress or to solve the problem of this kind of discrimination. On the one hand. On the other hand, if you take the language of backwardness or disadvantage, the form of backwardness or disadvantage that is introduced as a justification, namely economic hardship or form of poverty, if you like, is on very weak evidentiary ground compared to any other form of reservation. So in a sense, the EWS reservation in ideological or conceptual terms is a return to the proportional representation system of 1921-22, the first model that I spoke of, whose, from the point of view of the present, whose main characteristic is that that system of reservation, proportional distribution of the resources of the government, had no plan for doing away with caste. That is to say, it was an implicit admission of the permanence of caste. And what the EWS reservation does is that it strikes at the heart of the justification for the unreserved category by opening the door to its eventually being eaten away by similar such groups coming forward on evidence in the form of evidence, very shaky claims of some form of backwardness or the other. So it's now 7:22, so I would like to stop here. This is a very compressed history. I recognize that, but please feel free to ask questions. So I'm saying that there are various models of reservation that have, as an matter of empirical fact, operated in India and are operating in India. The way to evaluate them is to ask two questions. One, what is their position on the question, is there caste discrimination in India today? And two, do they fall in the discrimination side of the justifications, or do they fall on the disadvantage or backwardness side of the justifications? And finally, what vision of the future does a model of reservation offer? If you ask these questions, you will be in a position to orient yourself with what we see on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deshpande. And I am sure there will be a lot of questions in the thing. So to move on, let me welcome Miss Meena Kotwal. Good morning, Meena. Jai Bhim. And Meena Kotwal, for those of you who don't know, is an Indian journalist and a human rights defender. and she's the founder of the MOOC Naik. Yes, the same name as what Dr. Ambedkar had called one of his very first publications about 100 years ago. And the MOOC Naik is an online news channel and website focused on social justice for Dalits and marginalized people. So, Meena, all yours. We are trying to have our speakers speak for somewhere around 12 to 15 minutes, plus or minus. So if it goes too much around there, I will try and signal. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good morning और जय भीम। अभी मैं यहाँ यूएस में हूँ तो यहाँ पे तो अभी नाइट हो रही है तो सॉरी, मेरी बेटी की तबीयत सही नहीं है तो इसलिए मैं थोड़ा सा लेट भी जुड़ पाई। और जी बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, आपने मुझे यहाँ अपनी बात रखने का मौका दिया। तो बहुत सारी चीजें मैं सुन भी नहीं पाई हूँ सही से, सतीश जी ने जिस तरह से सारी चीजें कही हैं इससे पहले भी, तो मैं अपनी बात रखना चाहूंगी यहाँ पर कि मुझे क्योंकि अपनी पर्सनल जर्नी के बारे में बताना है, और क्योंकि मैं जिस कम्युनिटी से हूँ उस कम्युनिटी का में पैदा होना ही अपने आप में एक स्ट्रगल है, क्योंकि महिला ऊपर से दलित, तो स्ट्रगल अपना एक अलग स्ट्रगल मेरा रहता है और सबका रहता है जो भी इस कम्युनिटी में रहता है। और जर्नलिज्म में अगर हम लोग देखें तो दलित महिलाएं, इवन दलित भी नहीं है और महिलाएं तो बहुत दूर की बात है, तो है ही नहीं, वो दिखाई ही नहीं देती हैं। 2006 में जिस तरह से अनिल चमड़िया जी ने रिसर्च किया था तो उन्होंने भी यही देखा कि किस तरह से मीडिया में, चाहे वो प्रिंट मीडिया हो, चाहे वो रेडियो हो, टीवी हो, कोई भी दलित या आदिवासी जो है डिसीजन मेकिंग पोजीशन पर नहीं रहा है, एडिटर पोस्ट पर नहीं रहा है। तो ये बहुत ही दुखद है अपने आप में, क्योंकि हम जिस देश में रहते हैं 75 साल से ज्यादा हो गए उसको आजादी को, हम अमृत महोत्सव मना रहे हैं, लेकिन आज भी मीडिया में, जबकि मीडिया जो एक जर्नलिज्म में होता है या जर्नलिस्ट होता है उसकी कोई जाति या कोई धर्म नहीं होना चाहिए, लेकिन फिर भी हम लोग जिस देश में रहते हैं वहाँ पे जाति भी मैटर करती है आपकी और धर्म भी मैटर करता है, तो वो सब भी जर्नलिस्ट लेकर चल रहे हैं अपने साथ। तो 2006 का रिसर्च भी यही कहा और उसके बाद 2019 में भी यही रिसर्च हुआ, किस तरह से यही सेम रिसर्च हुआ था और उसमें भी यही पाया गया कि कैसे जो है दलित आदिवासी जो है आज भी मेन स्ट्रीम मीडिया में या एडिटर टीवी पर, रेडियो पर या डिजिटल मीडिया में नहीं पहुंच पाए हैं। तो ये बहुत अपने आप में दुखद है कि कोई भी दलित आदिवासी जर्नलिस्ट पहुंच ही नहीं पाए। इवन आदिवासी तो मुझे लगता है बैन ही है, क्योंकि वो ढूंढने से भी नहीं मिलते हैं, बहुत मुश्किल से आपको आदिवासी मिलेंगे, और जो दलित हैं वो भी छोटी मोटी पोजीशन पे आपको मिलेंगे, तो बड़ी पोजीशन पे वो आपको मिलेंगे ही नहीं। तो बहुत सारे, आज मैं मतलब अपना एक पुराना वीडियो भी देख रही थी तो उसमें भी यही सारी चीजों पर चर्चा हो रही थी कि क्या वजह है या कौन सा फिल्टर ऐसा है कि दलित आदिवासी अभी तक पहुंच ही नहीं पाए हैं, जबकि बड़े बड़े जर्नलिस्ट निकले हैं, बहुत सारे लोग निकले हैं, लेकिन क्या वजह है कि वो लोग पहुंच ही नहीं पाए हैं। तो रही बात महिलाओं की, तो महिलाएं भी नहीं हैं। और अगर आप लोगों को इस रिसर्च के बारे में पता हो, यूएन में एक रिपोर्ट छपी थी, वो इंडियन रिसर्च पर ही बेस्ड थी, कि दलित महिला जो है एक सवर्णा महिला से लगभग 15 साल कम जीती है। तो इसके बारे में कहीं चर्चा नहीं होती, जब हम कोई मुद्दा उठाते हैं, कोई बात उठाते हैं, चाहे वो हाथरस का मामला हो, दिल्ली कैंट में रेप का मामला हो, और इस तरह से तमाम मामले होते हैं। तो जब मैं इस तरह के मामले उठाती तो हूँ तो मुझे बहुत सारे लोग कहते हैं कि उसको महिला जैसा देखना चाहिए, हमें दलित महिला नहीं देखना चाहिए उसमें। तो जब महिला जन्म लेती है तो उसकी भी वही जाति और धर्म उसके साथ जुड़ जाता है। तो यहाँ पे जब 15 साल कम जीती है, या हाथरस का मामला देख लीजिए, जिस तरह से उस लड़की के साथ रेप होता है, जिस तरह से उसको जला दिया जाता है आधी रात में, और मीडिया जो है पहले उसमें मौन बना रहता है शुरुआत से, और आखिर में जब आता है वो, तो उस मामले को ही बिगाड़ देता है कि किस तरह से उसकी भाभी के ऊपर आरोप लगाए जाते हैं कि वो नक्सलवादी है और पता नहीं उसको क्या क्या कहा जाता है, और जिस तरह से उसका जजमेंट भी आया, आप लोगों ने देखा होगा, जजमेंट भी सेटिस्फाइड नहीं है उसमें। अब जजमेंट में यही आया है कि लड़की के साथ रेप ही नहीं हुआ है, जिसमें सीबीआई भी मौजूद थी, सीबीआई ने माना भी था, बहुत सारी चीजें हुई, लेकिन फिर भी उसमें अब कहा जा रहा है कि उसमें रेप ही नहीं हुआ। ये दिल्ली कैंट का अगर आपको मामला पता हो, दिल्ली कैंट में भी इसी तरह से हुआ था कि लड़की जो है 9 साल की बच्ची है, उसके साथ जिन्होंने रेप किया, तो जो ऑपरेशन कम्युनिटी से थे, उन्होंने रेप उसके साथ किया, लेकिन फिर भी वहां पे लोग कह रहे हैं कि वो सिर्फ एक बच्ची थी इसलिए उसके साथ रेप हुआ। नहीं, ऐसा नहीं है। उसको, वो लड़की दलित थी, क्योंकि जिन्होंने उसके साथ रेप किया उनको पता थी वो लड़की कौन है, उसका बैकग्राउंड क्या है, उसकी कास्ट क्या है, वो क्या कर सकती है, कितना स्ट्रांग है, उसका बैकग्राउंड क्या नहीं, सब कुछ उसके दिमाग में था। जिन्होंने रेप किया उनको उसके घर में 15 दिन पहले ही जो है उसकी बेटी की शादी हुई थी। तो क्या रेप करने के थॉट उसको अपने परिवार में नहीं आए होंगे? उसके आसपास भी सब महिलाएं रही होंगी, तब उसको नहीं आए, लेकिन उसको पता था कि वो लड़की कौन है, क्या कर सकते हैं उसके माँ बाप, सब कुछ उसके दिमाग में चला, तब उसने उसका रेप किया। तो सिर्फ वो लड़की लड़की नहीं थी, वो दलित बच्ची थी, इसलिए उसके साथ रेप हुआ। तो इस तरह के तमाम ऐसे हम लोग अगर देखें तो बहुत सारे मामले हैं, और ट्रोलिंग करना बहुत आसान है। और जब हम लोग इस मामलों को, इस तरह के मामलों को उठाते हैं, तो हमें ही जो है कहा जाता है कि हम ही लोग कास्टिस्ट हैं और फेमिनिज्म का झंडा उठा के चल रहे हैं। बहुत सारी चीजें हम लोगों को कहा जाता है कि महिला कार्ड खेल रहे हैं, दलित कार्ड खेल रहे हैं, इतनी गालियां हम लोगों को दी जाती है। आप मेरे कोई भी पोस्ट उठा के देखिए, ट्विटर पे, फेसबुक पे, इंस्टाग्राम पे, कोई भी सोशल मीडिया पे अगर कोई पोस्ट उठा के देखेंगे तो उसमें आपको तमाम गालियां मिलेंगी। तो वो गालियां लगातार आपको काम करने पर मिलती रहती हैं, जिस तरह का हम लोग काम कर रहे हैं उसमें गालियां आपको मिलती हैं, आपको रेप थ्रेट मिलते हैं, आपको मारने की धमकी मिलती है। मेरी बच्ची छोटी सी है, 3 साल की बेटी है, उसको तक नहीं छोड़ा जाता, उसको भी गालियां मिलती हैं, उसको भी धमकियां मिलती हैं। तो बहुत मुश्किल है, बहुत मुश्किल है हम लोग जिस तरह से हम लोग काम कर रहे हैं, जिस देश में हम लोग काम कर रहे हैं। तो और मूक नायक की शुरुआत भी मैंने उसी गुस्से में की थी कि किस तरह से हम लोगों ने कास्टिज्म को उसको फेस किया था। इसलिए मैं जिस मीडिया में रही थी, मैं पहले तो मैं मीडिया छोड़ के ही चले गई थी, क्योंकि मुझे मीडिया में वो इंटरेस्ट भी नहीं आ रहा था, और जिस तरह का डेटा कह रहा था कि कोई भी डिसीजन मेकिंग में नहीं रहता है दलित आदिवासी, तो मुझे लग रहा था उस समय कि मैं कितनी भी मेहनत कर लूं तो मुझे तो आगे बढ़ने ही नहीं दिया जाएगा। तो वो सोच के साथ मैंने जर्नलिज्म छोड़ दिया था। लेकिन जब मैंने वापसी की, तो जिस डर के वजह से मैंने छोड़ा था वो मैंने अपने ऊपर प्रैक्टिस किया, और उस प्रैक्टिस करने के दौरान ही बहुत सारी चीजें हुई, और अब उसके बाद मैंने अपना मीडिया शुरू किया। तो एक गुस्से में मैंने उस समय शुरू किया था, क्योंकि आज भी जैसे हम लोग जिस मीडिया की बात करें, मेन स्ट्रीम मीडिया है, वहां पे दलित आदिवासी तो है ही नहीं, महिलाएं तो पहुंच ही नहीं रही हैं। महिला तो बहुत पीछे, मतलब महिलाएं तो, दलित महिला तो उस पायदान पे खड़ी जहां तक किसी की नजर ही नहीं जा रही है। डाइवर्सिटी के नाम पे हम लोग भले ही पुरुष में महिलाएं को रख लेते हैं, या फिर अगर क्या कहते हैं, अगर वो कास्ट में रखते हैं तो उसमें पुरुष को लाते हैं, महिलाओं को बहुत पीछे छोड़ देते हैं। तो महिलाएं तो उस पायदान पे खड़ी हैं जहां तक किसी की नजर नहीं जाती। तो जब मैंने मूक नायक की शुरुआत की थी, तब मेरे अंदर भी वही गुस्सा था कि एक तो मीडिया में नहीं है, ऊपर से जो दूसरा मीडिया है, अल्टरनेटिव मीडिया भी आया है, या उसके अलावा अल्टरनेटिव का भी अल्टरनेटिव मीडिया शुरू हुआ, उसमें भी महिलाएं नहीं है, दलित महिलाएं तो हैं ही नहीं, बिल्कुल भी नहीं है। तो उस कमी को पूरा करना था, उस जगह को पूरा करना था मुझे लगा कि हम जिस आइडियोलॉजी को फॉलो कर रहे हैं, जिसलिए हम लोग काम कर रहे हैं, उसमें भी हम महिलाओं को पीछे छोड़ रहे हैं, या जिन आइकन्स को हम लोग मानते हैं वो हमेशा महिलाओं को आगे रखते थे, लेकिन फिर भी हम लोग महिलाओं को पीछे छोड़ रहे हैं। तो उस गुस्से में नायक की शुरुआत की गई थी, और शुरुआत करने के बाद बहुत सारी दिक्कतें तो होती ही हैं कि आप कहीं फंडिंग लेने जाते हैं, तब आपकी कास्ट आगे आ जाती है, आपको कम आंका जाता है हर चीज में, आपको कोई देता नहीं है, फंडिंग नहीं देता है, स्टोरीज करने के लिए महिलाएं है तो महिलाओं को हमेशा पीछे रखा जाता है। तो वो सारी चीजें हम लोगों ने झेली। तो जी, बाल मुरली जी, अगर आपके कोई सवाल है तो प्लीज आप सवाल भी पूछते रहें, बीच में किसी और का कोई सवाल है तो वो पूछते रहे। तो वो सारी चीजें लगातार झेल रहे हैं। एक्चुअली सॉरी, मैं सही से आज बोल नहीं पा रही हूँ, बेटी की तबीयत खराब थी तो वो भी अंदर बुला रही थी।
नहीं ठीक है। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया मीना जी। मुझे पता नहीं था कि आप हिंदी में बात करेंगी, तो मुझे थोड़ा अनुवाद करना चाहिए अब लोगों को. So let me just very quickly capture a little bit of the very complex things that Meena ji has shared. I was unfortunately unaware that this needed translation, so I hurriedly started taking some notes. She is in many ways making a trenchant critique of existing um, existing attempts to create diversity. She starts off by laying out the very many difficulties faced by Dalits and Adivasis, especially in the media. And she says that even today it is extremely difficult to see any Dalit or Adivasi in Indian media. And when she asks why this is so, she comes up with a variety of different things that are happening to Dalit and Adivasi women. But she, at some point, focuses in on the fact that both Dalit as well as Adivasi women have clearly faced the brunt of a long history of violence, caste-based as well as sexual-based violence. And for example, a UN report that she cites shows that Dalit women's life expectancy is about 15 years less than Savarna women, and that both jati as well as dharma or religion accrues to people right from birth, and it just continues in that way, as seen in the countless rapes and assaults on Dalit and Adivasi women. And plus the current trend, and it's not just the current trend, it is a longer history of courts to reject any recognition of these crimes and actually end up acquitting the rapists. But not only that, also that society at large seems to be denying or not paying much attention to such kinds of atrocities. And whereas most of these rapes and assaults were actually perpetrated intentionally and calculating the kind of caste equations that, within which Dalit and Adivasi women live their lives. And instead of paying attention to that, Dalit and Adivasi women are themselves subjected to insults and invectives, and even accusations that they are the ones who are actually being casteist and not the ones who are perpetrating casteist assaults. And and she talked about how regularly they get abuses and threats, and even threats to her child, who is by the way a little sickly today, and that's the reason why Meena ji is not been able to join us easily. But under these conditions, Meena is talking about how the few Dalit and Adivasis who are there in the media and the world of work in India end up actually having to work under these conditions. And she said that she had earlier left the media in disgust in her earlier work, but then she came back despite all the things that she'd faced because of her need to struggle against the very same fear for which she had left. And then she was saying that even when we speak of and do diversity, we still leave behind women. So I'm actually going to stop there. I know this has not been able to capture all the things that Meena ji shared. If anyone else feels that there was something else I missed and valuable to share, please do so. But Meena ji, dhanyavad. We will see if
मैं
anyone
बस
else. Yes,
एक बात
yes,
जोड़ना
go ahead.
चाहूंगा just to add to what
Please.
said. I think it's very important to point out or to underline that Meena ji was saying that one of the reasons she returned was because of her anger at what was going on. So there is this is a existential fact in India today, that while on the one hand we have, we have anger of various kinds that, angers and resentment, perhaps more than anger on one side, and a built up rage from decades on the other side that we are faced with in India. तो मीना जी, आपने जो गुस्से की बात कही थी, मैं उसे यहाँ जोड़ना चाहता था क्योंकि वो रह न जाए और लोगों को ऐसा न लगे कि ये केवल यानी कोई सेमिनार वाली बात है जो निपटा दी जाएगी इसी स्तर पे.
जी.
Thank you so much. Yes, Meena ji, बोलिए.
थैंक यू सो मच. एक्चुअली मुझे भी नहीं पता था, आपने पूछा भी नहीं था, नहीं तो मैं पहले से बता देती. आई एम सो सॉरी.
नहीं ये तो
Balmurli, Professor Thorat is trying to join. So
okay, all right.
In the meantime, you could introduce, is he here? No. Just give him a few more minutes, but we can.
Well, why don't we, okay, while we wait for Professor Thorat, why don't we just open it up and we could take questions. I will need one of the organizers' help to recognize folks, and please, so my suggestion is, please make your...
Balmurli, we still have Ria that hasn't spoken yet. She wanted to
all right, so
give us all a report on the California caste discrimination. If you can take a few minutes, then we can start the Q&A.
Ria, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll have the Q&A.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for having me here. And so I'm the policy director for Hindus for Human Rights, and as Raju said, Hindus for Human Rights is part of a larger group of organizations who are part of this effort to pass a caste discrimination bill in California. As Raju mentioned, there have been resolutions to combat caste discrimination in the US, most notably in Seattle. And now in California, another bill has been introduced. And if it passes, it will be the first state to ban caste discrimination. So HFHR is part of a coalition called America Against Caste Discrimination, which is led by our Ambedkarite partners, including the Ambedkar King Study Circle and the Ambedkar International Center. SB 403 was introduced by Senator Aisha Wahab and would make caste a protected category in California civil rights law, just the way racial and gender discrimination are illegal in California. This would also add caste as one of those categories under which you cannot discriminate someone against. It comes in response to recent controversies around caste discrimination, especially in Silicon Valley, and most notably right now, Cisco is being sued for caste discrimination by a few employees. And so on the other side, there's also a lot of organizing against this bill. Hindu nationalists particularly have argued that SB 403 unfairly discriminates against Hindu Americans and Indian Americans, but this bill really goes out of its way to make sure that South Asians and Hindus are not unfairly subjected to scrutiny. So first, it acknowledges that caste is not limited to one religious practice within South Asia. And then second, it recognizes that systems of discrimination exist in other parts of the world that are very similar to the Varna system in South Asia. But even if this particular language was not included in the bill, this bill does not interrupt Hindu practices. You can still build temples, you can still hold holy celebrations, you can still practice Hinduism, nor does it require people who identify as South Asian to show that they are not casteist. So if you are not casteist, your life will not be adversely affected in any way. Very much similar to civil rights bills, where if you're not racist or you're not discriminating people based on gender, your life moves along as usual. So another argument that the opposition is using is that this bill is unnecessary because if you experience caste discrimination, you should be protected against discrimination under existing California law. This, however, is not the case. In Seattle, the Office of Civil Rights said that Seattle's bill finally gave the office the tools it needed to help protect Seattleites against caste discrimination. And this would be the case in California if this bill passes. Already, employers like Apple and most recently Cisco, partially due to its lawsuit, and then universities like the California State University system have banned caste discrimination in their workplaces and schools. The California bill would ban caste discrimination everywhere in California. One thing that Raju has said before and is worth listening carefully to is that many of the arguments that have been constructed in opposition to this bill are very familiar to the arguments that were used to stop policies to protect people against racial and gender discrimination. For example, the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 would unfairly target the rights of white people, or stronger protections against sexual harassment in the workplace could lead to men being unfairly victimized for such claims. But these arguments have never been strong enough to bend the moral arc of the universe away from justice. So the bill right now, as it stands, is in the California Senate. That's why it's SB. And it's been referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the committee that usually takes up civil rights laws. This bill should be taken up for consideration soon, probably in the next 2 weeks, where the state senators who sit on the Judiciary Committee will analyze it and then vote on whether or not it should pass the committee. So once it passes through the committee, it will be voted on by the entire California State Senate, and then it will be referred to the California Assembly. There it would go through a very similar process where it would be referred to an assembly committee, considered by that committee, and then voted on by the full assembly. So once both parts of the California legislature finalize the bill, because the assembly bill could be slightly different or amended from the Senate bill, if it passes both and it's reconciled, Governor Gavin Newsom will sign it into law. And because California is such a large state, this could take quite some time. But once this bill is signed, Californians who experience caste discrimination will be able to pursue justice when they are pushed out of a job, passed over for a promotion, denied a lease, or punished academically because of their caste identity. So for all the Californians who are either in the audience or watching from home, you can find out if your California state senator sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And if they do, you can call them to ask if they can support SB 403. And crucially, you don't have to be a US citizen to actually do this. If you live in California, you can call your senators and your assembly members. So to do this, you can go to the California Secretary of State's website to find out who represents you in Sacramento and which committees they sit on. And even if your state senator does not sit on the Judiciary Committee, you should talk to them about your support for this bill and why your state senator should support this bill. You can also find out who your assembly member is and have these same conversations. And then crucially, tell your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors to also tell their elected officials to support this bill. That's all from me.
Thank you, Ria. I think it's much needed because we usually always have ways in which we would like to know what things can be done here in the local politics here and how probably reservations and the caste question, of course, operates in the diaspora. But since we're already about 1 hour, 20 minutes into the thing, I don't want it to go too far. Can we have some questions?
Professor Thorat is here.
Oh, he is. Excellent. All right.
I looked at the question. There are only 2 comments, so we are fine.
Right.
But I'm going to ask people here after Professor Thorat speaks.
Well, thank you, Professor Thorat, and welcome and good morning and Jai Bhim. Professor Thorat needs very little introduction to any of us who followed anything to do with social justice in India over the last several decades. He is one of India's leading economist and a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also has been the ex-chairperson of the University Grants Commission, and has authored many pioneering works that highlight how caste operates and what needs to be done about it, including reservations. So, Professor Thorat, all yours. We've had Meena Kotwal and Ankur, as well as Satish go before you, and we would like you to say a few words about some of the historical aspects of how we need to think about this today. Thank you.
Good morning to all. I hope I am sufficiently audible, Murli.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry I miss most all of you, as a matter of fact. You know, my institute, Indian Institute of Dalit Study, has completed 20 years. So there is a function today and tomorrow. So in Delhi, and I came to Delhi. I stay in Nagpur. And Satish Deshpande will join. He knows about it. And so there was some connection problem in the hotel. I am staying in a hotel, and that's why I could not join. My apology. But I really congratulate you and appreciate your work for taking this initiative for discussion on the issue of reservation. Well, I think the historical aspect of the reservation policy is fairly known, but I think the contemporary issues in that context need to be highlighted. Well, reservation, as if we go back to the reservation policy, there were certainly an attempt on the part of some of the princely state like Sayajirao Gaikwad and Shahu Maharaj, who formally reserved certain position for backward caste. It goes back to their period. But the real and lot more systematic justification for reservation came to Dr. Ambedkar, of which the beginning was made in 1990 in his first memorandum to the South Bureau Commission, which was sent from London, of course, to sort of revise the British Constitution after every 10 years. And that is the basic framework which Ambedkar laid down. And the basic argument at that point of time was that the caste system and institution of untouchability denied equal rights, right to employment in military, police, and public service, and of course private sector, right to education to the untouchable. He quoted evidence as late as 1854, where the boy from the Harvard tried to get admission in the school. The admission was denied to him. He represented the Bombay Viceroy for justification, and they didn't consider it. They didn't deny right to education to him, but they say that if by admitting one scheduled caste boy, if the school is closed down, that was the threat given by the high caste, those who run that school, public school. So the right to education was very late. And of course, there was no representation in the legislature. So the basic argument of Dr. Ambedkar was that basic citizenship rights were denied to scheduled castes. Therefore, he made 4 points. One was, of course, that everybody should have equal right. Second, he said that there has to be legal protection against the violation of the citizenship right. And third, that even if you have a legal protection, only the individual can go to the court and have a justice. But there won't be a representation in various spheres of the government unless we have some policy. And therefore, he recommended that there has to be a certain quota earmarking so that they get a fair share by whichever criteria. And at that time, the population criteria was accepted. So these were the 4 major points, and 3 points. And 4 major point was that he wanted, of course, the reservation in public employment, in education institutions, some fund for educational development, reservation in legislature. And the 4th one was the institutional arrangement. That is that there has to be some organization, a body, just like we have now, Scheduled Caste Corporation, commission to look into their problem from time to time. So this was the basic demand by him. But one of the, what we have to understand is the theoretical basis which led him to justify reservation, which even he eventually got. The political reservation he got in 1931 through the Pune Pact with Gandhiji. And in 1944, then in Pune Pact, there was a promise that the effort will be made to have a fair share in public services and education. But that was not the part of the Pune Pact. That was just an additional promise. Ambedkar took that promise, wrote a confidential letter to the Viceroy at that time. And in 1944, when he was a labor minister, he got the reservation. So all the reservation in public sector, education fund, legislature, he got before the independence. It was only carry forward to the independence. In the education, he had sent the first batch of 8 to 10 people, a student to London and UK for scholarship for some courses. Now, I would like to make one point, and that is very important because that comes up in the current discussion quite often. And that point is that at that time, minority was defined in terms of population. And Ambedkar had a problem that, yes, scheduled caste was a minority, but it was not a religious minority. So he brought through 2 theoretical improvements. Those are very relevant even today because the way Supreme Court give orders and interpret this is problematic. Ambedkar argued that he changed the definition of minority as such. He argued that the minority became a minority, yes, by population. That is the first indicator. But the second is that the minority should, unless it is discriminated, it cannot deserve the consideration that it requires. So he brought a discrimination criteria to define a community as a minority, and then argued that economically the muscle power of Muslim and Europeans and the Christians is much higher than that of a scheduled caste. Scheduled castes are worse. So economic discrimination he brought. The second hurdle he has to cross was that the representation, personal representation, because there was an argument at that point of time, okay, scheduled castes need to have a representation, but somebody else can represent them. Maharishi Shinde was the one who made this argument in around 1925. So Ambedkar said, no, the represent should be of a person, of that person from the same community, because they know their problem, they are sensitive. So after having overcome this hurdle, then in the roundtable conference, he finally got that political reservation. He revised the South Bureau Commission memorandum in 1929, when he once again appeared before the Simon Commission, and then the memorandum was revised in the roundtable conference, which finally led to the reservation in the politics through Pune Pact. Now, I think the basic argument, I think that if we all take this together in the present context, is that the problem of scheduled caste and a similar group all over the world who face discrimination in terms of denial of equal right on the basis of their group identity. If a group is denied equal right on the basis of identity, right or wrongly, or with prejudice, they require protection. Because they are denied not only equal opportunity, but there is no equality before law. And at times the denial of right goes to economics, education, political, and is result into serious deprivation. So you do require a policy. Now there are several arguments against the reservation policy, which I have dealt in my paper, Prejudice Against Reservation Policy in EPW. All the argument I have dealt into this. And these are all myth created by those who criticize reservation policy. But the important point at the end of the day is this, that as long as the scheduled caste and a similar group continue to have denial on the basis of a group identity excluded, and which has consequences, then you require a policy. So the untouchable require a dual policy. One is, of course, economic empowerment, because they deny right to land and business and enterprises. You require to give them land, you require to promote businesses. That can be done through general policy with the element of some reservation and reservation. But what is critical is that the second problem is that the discrimination continues despite law, despite provision. We have an Untouchability Offence Act of 1955, Atrocity Act of 1989, and yet discrimination is rampant. We have a book of Desh-Pandey is one of the co-authored, The Untouchability in Rural India in 2020, and discrimination persists in a significant manner. So if you have a discrimination in terms of denial of right, you ought to have a reservation policy or some provision whereby you can give a space. And Ambedkar was so right that the reservation we started with scheduled caste got extended to scheduled tribe, got extended to OBC, got extended informally to women, got extended informally to Muslims and other minority, and finally to economically weaker section. And yet there is a reservation. But reservation to reservation. So, but then the point is I want to make only one point finally, that I think on theoretical justification, either coming from economists and sociologists also. Economists, of course, have developed theories, beginning with Baker, 1956, then coming down to Arrow, then identity theory by Akerlof, and then William Darity, again identity value theory, and all of this we put together justify it. Now, the current status of the discussion is that the reservation, although we have a reservation in India, it has not given a very significant impact. There is a mobility among the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, but the limitation is that the private sector, where exactly the discrimination happens, is completely excluded. Almost 80% of our employment in private sector, entire business is in private sector. There is huge privatization now. The moment you privatize, there is a reservation. So private sector, where exactly is where discrimination is excluded. And the other important thing is that the economic policy for land distribution and improving the ownership of capital asset and education has not been quite successful, because that has not become a part of clear-cut policy of reservation. Some land distribution program, some procurement policy for Dalit entrepreneurship, but nothing much has come, and therefore the landlessness, illiteracy is a major problem of scheduled caste that continues today. Therefore, we have begun to argue, me and the Amit Thorat, and we have begun to argue that what we require is that in addition to reservation policy, in terms of giving specific quotas in several spheres to have a fair share, what you require is the reparation policy. And reparation is a policy, as you know, William Darity has brought out a book. It has become a famous book. We are bringing out a book here now. The reparation means that you require to give compensation to the scheduled caste, particularly for denial of economic right to property, right to capital asset, right to education, and of course, civil right and others are taken by the law. But basically, the economic denial has been there for almost, even if we begin with Manusmriti, 175 BC, it is more than about 2000 years. There is no community in the world which has been denied right to education, right to property for such a long period of time. Slavery was about 400, 500 years, but never in the history you find a group suffered from such denial. And that is why you find their situation is very bad. So you require a reparation policy whereby you can give land and businesses as a one-point program and increase their ownership of capital asset. Then I think there will be a transformation. Otherwise, I do not see much future for the scheduled caste. This is a reservation policy because the privatization is being eroded very, very significantly. Very small proportion of employment is now in the reservation. So reparation is necessary simply because the higher caste benefited at the cost of the lower caste. That is the justification. If you harm somebody, he has to pay a rupee back. Now, the untouchable were denied those rights. Not only they were denied right, but the Brahmins and the higher caste, particularly Kshatriya and Vaishya, benefited from the denial of the scheduled caste. So those who benefited at the cost of scheduled caste, they need to compensate for the scheduled caste. And there are examples in our country of repression. Of course, all over the world, there are several examples. Germany, Japan, and USA itself. They compensated for Japan for their segregation during the Second World War. But there are several examples. But our example is, when the refugees from Pakistan came to India in lot number, they were given a certain amount of money and they were given a land. And you see, the people, lakhs of people coming from Pakistan without any asset, just barefoot and on some cloth on their body. They are now, all of them are economically reasonably well off. So reparation policy helps if you take it seriously. But the major point that persists today is this, the major obstacle, that the high caste refuse to deny. Whenever we point out the situation, they refuse to deny and accept that the discrimination continues, that a solid and important policy is necessary. Now you look at the situation in USA, the lady, I don't know her name, but she was explaining the situation, the steps being taken in likely to take in Karnataka and Seattle's, and of course several universities like Brandeis, Harvard, Brown, they have taken a decision. What is the response of the higher caste in USA? They denied it. They say that we are victimized. What kind of logic it is? You at least accept that there is a caste and that the caste discrimination can persist, but never high caste have that big heart and that psychology which accept that the discrimination is there and something should be done. This is not big thing on the part of the Hindus, but that is not the history, of the Hindus, that they have never accepted, exception apart, they have never accepted the caste system's problem of caste system and untouchability and came out quite openly. Exception apart, there are several of exception, not only one. But if you look at the systematic history right from the ancient India to medieval and to the British, they have been consistently opposing the idea of equality and equity replacement. So Ambedkar has a theory, revolution and counter-revolution. If Vaidism supported the caste system, the Sramanism opposed it. Buddhism opposed it. In medieval period, the Brahmin remained quiet because there was no much scope. But in British period, they again say that you don't touch the caste system. You may be knowing that the first Anglo-Indian Act came in 1772, first Anglo-Indian by East India Company. And they think that they proposed that sati and childhood and child marriage, widowhood and sati and child marriage should be stopped. The Brahmin, Ram Manohar Rai opposed, but eventually later on they accepted that, okay, you can have a law. But they warned literally to the East India Company that don't touch the caste system. So if you read the 1772 Anglo-Indian regulation, they maintain that the social relation, economic relation will be governed by the Hindu Shastras. And not only that, a Hindu Pandit was attached to the court. Whenever the issue will come, he will interpret according to Hindu Shastra. When the issue of slavery came for a discussion, the Pandit who was attached to the court, he said that Manusmriti justifies slavery. There are 15 slaves, and Narada has justified slavery. So slavery was not touched at that point of time. So Brahmins have opposed, and that tradition still continues. Now, after 2014, now there is so much of revival that even people talk about openly about Manusmriti. People talk about openly about Rigveda, and when they talk about Rigveda, they forget that there is a caste system supported by the in Veda. Dr. Ambedkar has a riddle in Hinduism, volume 4. He has given all the Hindu Shastras, Veda, Purana, Upanishada, all the Smritis, Gita, and given a quotation, each one of them have supported caste system. So that is why caste system remain prevalent, because in family, these are the religious book. Main argument of Ambedkar is that slavery has gone, although racial discrimination persisted, but untouchability and caste discrimination doesn't go because it has a religious base. And you see now the revival of the religion. Our Prime Minister presented the copy of Gita to the Japanese Prime Minister. He should have presented Buddha and his Dhamma, but he presented Gita, not realizing that Gita supported Varna Vyavastha, Varna system. Now you find the preaching constantly going on television about Ramayana, Mahabharata, everything. They have a right to preach the religious ideology. We don't have a problem. But Ramayana, when it talk about this religious ideology, it talk about caste system. Valmiki supported caste system. Shambhuka was killed. Same is the situation. Mahabharata, Puranas are worse. Now, this religious base, in my view, because there is also in Manusmriti is quietly written that all Brahmin children should be taught and they should read the religious book in the house. Now, when they read religious book, Ramayana, Gita, they don't only learn religious principle, they also learn the social system of caste system. That's why when they come into higher education institution or society, their behavior is a replica of what they have learned in the family. So I think the point, I don't know whether I'm talking too much. I will cut it short now. I can take some questions.
Yeah.
Is that the what you find in USA is in tune with what has happened in the ancient and medieval and British India, where high caste never overwhelmingly came against the caste system. They can defend their religion. There, I don't have a problem. Belief in God, ritual, karma siddhanta, rebirth, fairly enough. It's a faith. They can go ahead, but they cannot defend on the name of religion the caste system. And so this huge inferiority complex, which led the Hindu organization in USA to go to the court against California state or to oppose it. What they have to do is to simply say that yes, caste system justifies inequality and deprivation of scheduled caste. We support it. We support all. That doesn't affect them. Their identity, Hindu identity, which they are saying that it is stigmatized. So I think this persistence of caste system has roots in religion, and also, of course, the economics talk. One point I'll make: economics, all theories talk about is that the motive is not only the spiritual and high social status. Motive is economics. Ambedkar has clearly examined entire Hindu literature. William Darity in his theory, or even Akralov, that the motive ultimately is economic. That by denying you the right, we benefit, and therefore there is a stubbornness. If any university, some of the scheduled castes come in, the Hindus are not comfortable about it. In India, at least, because that takes away their jobs. So I think the caste system, insofar as it's continued to give power, higher social status, and above all, the economic motive, the material motive, it will continue. The majority of Hindu will continue to oppose it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Thorat. I think I met you many years ago along with Martin Bai when you were getting started with the Dalit Foundation. I admire your work, and thank you so much for joining us to add your perspective. I would like to thank Professor Bal Murali Natarajan, who had committed to exactly 1.5 hours, and he had another appointment. He had to leave us. So at this point, with all of your permission, because we have not come to Q&A, I've been looking at the Q&A box, and I think some of them have been all answered. Yeah. And there aren't really questions, but comments, but I do appreciate those comments. Some of them were directed to Meenaji, and some of them about the California bill, which our policy director, Ria, will take up. But I wanted to ask whether, yeah, please. If you don't, just why don't you come on here so people can see you and you ask the question. If you prefer for me to read it, yeah. I'm going to ask question 2 first.
Oh, I see.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine, except if it requires clarification, I can.
Yeah. This is addressed to any of the panelists, right? Can you comment on merit as an argument regarding jobs contrasted to so-called, in quotes, caste nepotism? And the first question, are there positive examples of results of reservations in India on communities, castes, etc., and positive example of states doing this better? You can take it in any order. I think his question 1 was about the positive examples. And Srinivas is in the audience. He's asked that question. So any of you willing to take that up? I'd appreciate that. Ankur?
Professor?
Yeah, any of the panelists?
Or each of them.
Well, I think Deshpande would also like to, I think, contribute on merit argument, but I have examined this merit argument. Even in the Constitution and elsewhere, the reservation is subject to the minimum merit. So I don't, in that context, it doesn't undermine the merit itself. When you give admission or you employ a person, they are not of equally, all of them are of the highest merit. There is a range in which the people employed or student admitted would fall, but subject to the minimum condition, minimum qualification. So this argument for merit, which is played quite often, is not correct. It is baseless. But even if you look at some of the empirical study, there are no very many studies, but the Ashwini Deshpande study of the efficiency of employees in the railways, one of the largest sector in the country where they have a large number of scheduled castes. See, ultimately, Deshpande and Thomas, this book article brought by them, they found that there is no difference in efficiency in terms of certain indicators of efficiency between the scheduled caste and the high caste. And on the contrary, she found that in some cases the scheduled castes are more efficient than the high caste, simply because they suffer from this guilt that they are always condemned, that they are not efficient because of efficiency. So this merit argument is brought just to defend the space that they have enjoyed for several years. When there was a demand at the time of independence or before that for the Indianization of the bureaucracy, what was the argument? Precisely, this is what British were arguing, that you are not as qualified as the Britishers are, and efficiency wouldn't go down. At that time, the argument was equal participation, share, not the merit, subject to the minimum condition, but the argument was participation and share. At that time, that is what Ambedkar called that he made a difference between the good governor and efficient governance. You require efficient governor in the sense that people of reasonable merit should be there, but you have to have a good governance where everybody gets a equal share or fair share in the bureaucracy. Now, for their personal greed at that time, when Indianization argument was there, that time the good governance argument was there, not the merit. Now, when scheduled caste and other got it, now the argument of efficiency is brought in, which is also not correct. So that is my answer to this question. The second question is, of course, reservation has helped brought in mobility. Definitely, whatever lower middle class and middle class that you see is primarily because of reservation. The reason is that the bulk of the scheduled castes are landless and without capital asset. So agriculture and business is not the way out for them as much as it should be. The only way is to take education, and through the channel of reservation goes into the bureaucracy and to certain extent in private sector. So reservation has led to expansion of education and thereby the entry into the employment, public employment through reservation, which has helped them and brought some mobility. The only thing, the limitation of reservation is that it's confined to public sector. And the vast private sector in business and in employment is excluded. That is why you see they continue to lag behind compared to others in terms of poverty or whatever indicator of human development you take.
Professor Deshpande, would you like to?
Yes, Professor Thorat has already made the main arguments. This is a familiar argument. It keeps coming up all the time. I will just make some quick points. To start with the point with which Professor Thorat ended, we have to ask ourselves, when we are concerned about merit, what is our imagination or what is our conception of the default position of society on merit? Let us for the moment accept that in the cases like reservation, there is a deliberate intervention going on by the state. Okay, but what do you think is happening in the rest of society where the state is not intervening? Do you think the default position of society is meritocratic? You have to ask yourself that question and trying to give an honest answer as to what is happening in the rest of society where there is no reservation. Secondly, I would invite you to think about what do we mean by merit in terms of what is its content and what sorts of resources are needed in order to produce that content. We seem to think of merit as some kind of innate quality, some natural quality like our blood group or something, which is there present in you without your having to do anything. You have to do nothing to determine the blood group, right? It is there despite you. So merit is thought of often in that way, but it is not like that. Whatever differential potentials there might be in people need to be developed, need to be actualized. And for that, you need other material resources. So are the conditions for acquiring merit equally distributed in society? If they are not, what are you going to do about it? Thirdly, measurement of merit, as Professor Thorat was also pointing out. Do not confuse a ranking system with a system of basic evaluation. So just to take the crude example, you're constantly being asked, would you like your plane to be flown by a reservation candidate? The answer is, if you think only in terms of rankings, then for every examination, only one result matters, only one person matters, the person who scores the top. After that, everybody else should not matter. Otherwise, what is the meaning of the thresholds that are set for passing or being competent? So do you know that every pilot who flies a plane you're a passenger in scored the highest? We don't, right? So do not confuse ranking, especially when it starts to get measured in third decimal place. Don't confuse it with competence. Finally, and the point that probably most people refuse to or cannot see, in most work situations, performance is a joint product. My performance in an organization that I work in, for example, university and so on, is contributed to in part by my colleagues. So in most offices or other kinds of organizations, my performance is a joint product in which my colleagues also participate. So if my colleagues are already convinced beforehand that I am either competent or incompetent, so presumptions of competence as much as presumptions of incompetence produce a self-fulfilling prophecy. If my colleagues think I have decided that I'm incompetent, they will withhold their contribution to my performance, and therefore they will ensure that I will eventually turn out to be incompetent. If my colleagues presume that I am competent, then they will behave accordingly, and it will again become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because my performance will then become competent. So most performance in most organizations is a joint product and is dependent on the goodwill of people around us. And forms of social discrimination are precisely about the withholding of this goodwill, which produces the result that it predicts in the first place. So these are things to be kept in mind.
Thank you, Srinivas, for those questions. I just wanted to make a quick comment, and I have a question. And if there are no other questions from the audience, this might be the last one, so we could wrap it up. Yeah, just a quick comment when we talk about merit. I come from IIT Madras, and it's probably got the worst name in press, in media, about its inclusivity or lack thereof. I did invite the director to join us here, and as you can imagine, I did not get a response. And I put it in these terms that it's one thing to officially deny existence of discrimination, but it's another thing to engage with people who think there is discrimination and have a face-to-face dialogue, and that has never happened in IIT Madras as far as I know. So it's simply an official version, you know, he says, she says type of thing. And that's really most disturbing to me. And I'm not suggesting that I know for a fact there is a lot of caste discrimination. All I know is the need for a dialogue. And it is, as an alumnus of IIT Madras, I'm really, really sad. I've been trying to follow it up for so many years, to have such a dialogue, which could at least at a minimum lead to sensitivity training of faculty and staff about where the marginalized communities are coming from when they share some of the concerns that Ankur, for example, shared, rather than just dismiss them, sitting in your own office. So I just wanted to share that, because I hope that there will be a lot more dialogue and not talk to our own echo chambers. And that applies as much to the marginalized communities as well as to some of these institutions. A question I have, though, is you all heard about the California bill that is being tabled, and then Seattle has already passed the caste discrimination bill. What are the things, when you hear extensive testimonials from especially the caste oppressed communities, what comes across is a lot of it is can be seen as perception of discrimination, which may or may not hold up in a court of law, but nonetheless, they're real in the minds of people that are experiencing it. So my question, Ankur unfortunately is not here because some of the things that he shared also fall in that category. And this to me is an issue that we need to have a dialogue, because if you look at the Cisco caste discrimination case, or a lot of these testimonials, or Equity Labs survey of caste discrimination, probably 60–70% of the comments fall in this category. I'll give you one example. It's typical for upper caste supervisors or colleagues to ask you, where are you from in India? And searching questions along those lines are perceived by especially Dalit communities as they're trying to fix where you're from, what caste you're from. That may or may not be true, but nonetheless, the fact that such a perception exists is tragic. And that is a dialogue we need to have here. So I just wanted any of your comments about, in India, for example, it's very clear. It's not just a perception. There is large-scale violence going on Dalits, evidenced by the thousands of complaints received every day. We don't have that situation here, yet we are ahead of India in trying to legally abolish caste discrimination. Well, I shouldn't say that because the Constitution does abolish it, but it hasn't happened. So I just wanted your comments about the idea of, if you look at it from the privileged caste, they're liable to dismiss a lot of this, especially in this country, as simply perceptions. And none of us, the human resources, is not going to react to that unless there is a clear case of caste discrimination. So my real concern is some of these laws that are being enacted might falter the first 2 or 3 cases when it ends up to be a question of perception and they get dismissed. It's going to set us back actually forward. That's my concern. I fully support SB 403. But anyway, sorry for the long-winded question, but any thoughts on this issue of perception versus real discrimination? Perception is also real discrimination, but perception versus legally defensible, legally arguable caste discrimination.
Let me respond to this very quickly because you raised very important 2 questions. I would also like to take the second, but I'll also mention about the first. I think you are very, very right that the engagement and discussion with those who discriminate is very necessary. Because now they by and large, they live in a 2 separate world, alleging each other, but there is no coming together and sharing. So that you can remove prejudices and you began to believe in differences. Now, USA in 2000, when they realized that the higher education campuses are now diversified and you have not only white male and white female, but you have Black, you have Asian, you have Latino, and they discovered the problem of discrimination and exclusion, which they realized that this is bad. They set up a committee. And the committee came with one of the recommendations. I don't want to go into greater detail, that there is a need to sensitize those who discriminate from different groups.
I think he looks like Professor Thorat dropped off. Could you? Oh, there he is. Yeah. Oh, I think it's because.
Yeah, I think I'm okay. So to cut the story short, that I think in some of the universities, perhaps it is those courses being offered for the students, and there was a review in 2010 again. The point is that beside sensitizing the student to the problem of poverty, discrimination, inequality, sexism, and racism and other things, there is a pedagogy, that is, they bring the student from different groups together and ask them to explain their own religion or whatever. So people at least learn to accept that there are differences and that differences are not harmful. I think you are very right. And I have been writing continuously in India. but the government doesn't listen to it. Now, only yesterday the government has brought out a regulation by the UGC. It doesn't touch this issue of sensitization. You have to bring girls and boys together. You have to bring high caste and low caste together. You have to bring Muslim and Hindu together in the class and discuss it. Then you will see that there will be some difference. I think what we require is citizenship education. But I'll stop there. You have made a very important point. There is no beginning here in India. I as a chairman of the UGC, tried to do something, but there is a resistance to the issue of caste particularly. We have the gender regulations are taken seriously. Resolution regarding ragging has taken seriously, as a result of which ragging has almost disappeared from the campuses, the caste. The second issue that you are referring to is very important. Yes, I think the methodology used to capture the discrimination and to provide empirical evidence on discrimination is a difficult exercise. We brought out a book, Untouchability in Rural India, Satish Deshpande, myself, Ghanshyam Shah, and Savita Bhaviskar. We follow a methodology where we don't have only the quantitative analysis, yes or no, whether you get access to the well or to the temple, yes or no, but also because the discrimination is a social phenomena, behavioral phenomena. It is embedded into relationship. You experience it, but it is not revealed. So we brought case studies. We brought focus group discussion. In fact, in IRDS, in one of the study, we had a recording. When there was a discrimination in midday meal scheme, scheduled caste students will stand there and wait for higher scheduled caste student to finish their turn, and then they get the food from the distance, they sit separately. We put a camera there and secretly and record it. So because there is a denial of discrimination also, but nevertheless, discrimination being embedded into social relationship, experienced by the scheduled caste, you require a methodology to capture it. So I think the point that I want to make is here that although many studies of discriminations are based on the self-experiences of the scheduled caste, but unless we really capture the act of discrimination and provide the evidence, the opposition will continue. So it is a challenge for all of us to undertake study, which we have done in IIDS. Today we are celebrating 28th of IIDS. The first study on discrimination I started was in 2003, sanctioned by the ILO. And I had a tough time to develop the concept. What is this caste discrimination? What is discrimination associated with untouchability? What are the indicators of discrimination? How do we measure them? How do we capture them? The first study was 3 villages. Then I extended to 8 states. Then I extended to 4 states. Now my book is coming up along with Madheshwaran. That is discrimination in employment, wages and occupation and its impact on poverty. Nobody can deny that evidence. We have brought it up. But the point I think you have made is correct, that there is a challenge of identifying the discrimination and capturing it numerically, quantitatively, with a very sufficient proof is important. And I think studies can be taken in USA also, discrimination in higher education. For example, discrimination in higher education in India has become now a very critical issue. And I'm looking at the studies, it started with I being the chairman of that committee, the All India Institute of Medical Science, where scheduled caste student has committed suicide. It began. Now, Sukumar has brought out a book on discrimination in higher education. Earlier, the NUPA has brought out. But now I am reading, because of the recent suicide by the Solanki in IIT Mumbai, they have done 2 surveys. SCCL have done 2 surveys, and there are case studies. They are devastating. They are more serious than what might have been faced by Solanki, which led him to commit suicide. If you read it, it gets shivering. There are many students who confess that at several times they feel like resorting to a last resort. So discrimination is there, but one has to capture it. There is always a denial from the higher side. My report was rejected in All India Institute of Medical Science outrightly by the Executive Council. And then again, they asked me to chair the second committee, and I asked Deka, who was the chairman of the IMS, I said, how do you reject my first report, and now you say that I should be there in the second committee chairman? He said, there is another suicide. So there is always a denial. But I think you made a very important point that in USA also, you do require a systematic methodology-based studies of caste discrimination. And the USA has a strong tradition of methodology of capturing discrimination based on race and gender. There is no dearth of methodology. But I think with respect to caste, we should have a proper methodology so that you can make a point. And there is a discrimination, as you have rightly said. I was in Canada and I had a dental problem and I went to a doctor. He treated me. And then later on, he disclosed me, sir, if I disclose my caste gets disclosed, it, nobody will come to, very few will come to my dental hospital. My consumer will be confined to this, the lead. So there is a discrimination. But also, there may not be the classical form or formal form. There are changes. There are various indirect and form of discrimination. And it is difficult to capture them, but you have to develop studies. You have to develop method, capture and provide evidence. That's the only solution, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Professor Deshpande, do you want to add anything to that?
I just want to say it's, of course, laws are very important, but the law has its limitations also. So if discrimination is fundamentally an attitudinal thing, there are some parts of discrimination that are systemic and need not require the direct intervention, deliberate intervention of individuals. But there is also discrimination that is deliberately practiced. And we need methods outside the law. We need something like a social movement in an everyday sense, where we start to say no and refuse to participate in the small acts of discrimination that happen in everyday life. The way that things started happening with sexism, how informal sort of interruption of sexist language, sexist jokes, and sexist attitudes had a major role to play in the extent of change that has been possible. So we also need to think of it as not just restricted to the law. The law is important, but we have to go far beyond the law to change practices, to change attitudes. And Professor Thorat is very right. We need to think about those who are practicing discrimination. They are that is where the problem is, and that is what we have to address.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our hope here in California anyway, as the corporates start adding caste as a part of potential discrimination in their human resources policy, they will have to inevitably follow that up with management employee training on caste. And I think that gives us the opportunity to bring the communities together to talk more about it. So I'm hopeful. In fact, that's the real outcome that I like of all the advocacy that's been going on caste, rather than the law itself, as you mentioned. Professor Thorat mentioned IIT Bombay, so I'll leave you with this note. I had an occasion 3 years ago to meet a former dean of students of IIT Mumbai. And when we were talking about caste, and I will quote what he said. He said, why should groups in IIT Mumbai start protesting if something happened to Dalits in IIT Madras? They go around calling themselves Dalits. Why should they worry about what's going on in the rest of the country? I found that hard to comprehend, that there could be a dean of students who had that level of understanding of why it is important, not just for marginalized communities. I mean, everybody, commiserates on the basis of something. And here is a marginalized community that is speaking up for what's happening in IIT Mumbai, and he couldn't understand why Dalit students in IIT Madras were protesting. So I hope they have a better dean of students, especially in light of suicides and other things that have happened. But anyway, I just wanted to share that. Thank you. Thank you all who joined. Yeah, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add that when I visited IIT Mumbai for lecture, there are regulation brought out by the UGC against caste discrimination 2012, and to be enforced an administrative and anti-discriminatory officer. The acting director of IIT Mumbai was not aware about the regulation.
Yeah. Thank you. We have exceeded the time, but given the stellar panel we had and the discussion, I think it was time well worth spent. And thank you to all the panelists and those who have left us. And I will send them a thank you note. And all the people who have been on Zoom consistently. I noticed throughout these 2 hours, there's been very little drop-offs from Zoom. And it shows the level of interest. And have a good evening. And please do attend future Desh-Videsh conversations on topics like, I think the 2 topics that have been suggested for the next few months is the California textbooks, which now connects directly to what's happening to textbooks in India. And the second is the how Zionism and Hindu nationalism think alike. This has been voted on in the last 2 sessions by the people who listen, and I look forward to announcements that will be sometime in June and July. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to thank you guys for
Good program. Thank you.
sticking with us. And
Yeah.